Welcome everyone, this is Amer from Lieu Council. Today we'll talk about entitlement to overtime pay in Ontario. Many employees are unclear about their rights for overtime pay in Ontario. This is a common issue, and we're going to talk today about some of the essentials regarding overtime pay so you understand the basic concepts and have some clarity on when you are entitled to overtime pay and when you're not. We'll begin with the disclaimer that this course is not legal advice, so if you have any specific questions, you must contact a lawyer or paralegal. So what is overtime pay? Overtime pay is decided or is governed by Employment Standards Act 2000 in Ontario, and in other provinces there are other legislation, similar legislation that provides how the overtime pay is regulated in those provinces. So the fundamental concepts, the principles in this lecture are equally applicable to other provinces, but the legislation specific to overtime pay in each province is different, so you must check your province's legislation to make sure that you have a clear understanding of the hours and how much wages you are entitled to and whatnot. So Employment Standards Act for 2000 and Standard Act 2000 for Ontario. The basic concept you want to remember is that if you have worked for more than 44 hours per week, then you will be entitled to overtime pay, and that you will be entitled to time and a half. So if you were making an hourly wage of $20 an hour, then you will be entitled to $30 for that time period. Another concept you want to understand is that Employment Standards Act 2000 allows for averaging of these hours over 2 weeks or longer period, but there are some specific requirements for that averaging. It's not available to employers by default, and I'll show you a little bit about that specific section of Employment Standards Act. And then one final thing you want to keep in mind is that Employment Standards Act again allows employer to provide time in lieu as opposed to money for the overtime hours, but again there are specific requirements that must be fulfilled. This option is not available by default. So let's look at Employment Standards Act and see where this specific section is that deals with overtime pay. So if you scroll down in table of contents, this is Employment Standards Act 2000. You can type it up on Google and you will find it available online on Canly. That's one website, and many other websites you will find the legislation available. Part 8 of the Employment Standards Act deals with overtime pay, so let's click on that and see what it provides. Section 22 sub 1, an employer shall pay an employee overtime pay of at least 1.5 times his or her regular rates for each hour of work in excess of 44 hours in each work week, or if another threshold is prescribed. And this is what another threshold is prescribed is. What that means is you can see further down below about averaging and time in lieu and whatnot. But essentially 44 hours plus per week. If you work those many hours, then you are entitled to time and a half. I talked about averaging. This is the subsection 2 that talks about averaging. An employee's hours of work may be averaged over separate, non-overlapping, contiguous periods of 2 or more consecutive weeks for the purpose of determining the employee's entitlement, if any, to overtime pay if, and these are the specific conditions, the employee has made an agreement with the employer that his or her hours of work may be averaged over a period of a specific number of weeks. So you as an employee must have that agreement, otherwise the employer cannot average on his or her own. Or the employer has received an approval under section 22.1 that applies to the employee or a class of employees that includes the employee. This approval is actually obtained from the Director of Employment Standards Act, and so that needs to be done. And then it talks about averaging. So these are some of the specific terms, but the key message that you want to keep in mind is that if you work for more than 44 hours, then you will be entitled to overtime pay. Here is subsection 7 that talks about time in lieu. The employee may be compensated for overtime hours by receiving 1 or 1.5 hours of paid time off work for each hour of overtime worked instead of overtime pay if the employee and the employer agrees to do so. So your agreement is essential. If you're not agreeing to it, then you must get paid. And the paid time off work is taken within 3 months of the work week in which the overtime was earned, or with the employee's agreement, if you're agreeing to it, within 12 months of that work week. So there are specific requirements when an employer can can offer you time in lieu, and those absent those specific conditions, the basic principle is that you're entitled to time and a half for 44 hours plus work in excess of 44 hours per week. Now, a question arises, which is very, very common, and this is a common misunderstanding. Clients come to us all the time and say that I am not entitled to overtime pay because I was a salaried employee. I was making specific amount of income regardless of the hours, so I assume that I'm not entitled to overtime hours. I'm making $30,000 annually, or I'm making $60,000 annually, and so my paycheck is quite specific and it's not based upon the hours. I don't get paid based on $15 an hour or $20 an hour. And so there's an assumption made by employees that if you are a salaried employee, you're not entitled to overtime pay. Absolutely incorrect assumption. So please keep in mind that whether you are a salaried employee or whether you are making hourly wages, it has no bearing on your entitlement to overtime pay. If you are working for more than 44 hours per week, it does not matter whether you're a salaried employee or an hourly waged employee, you are entitled to overtime pay. It's a very, very common misconception, and I think it's important for you to understand that. What about low income versus high income? We sometimes get clients who make significantly high income, and somehow they believe that overtime pay is only for employees who are much junior, who do not make a lot of money. And I want you to be clear that whether you're making $30,000 per year per annum or $150,000 per annum, it actually has no bearing. It makes no difference in law to your entitlement to overtime pay. I have had a number of clients who work in investment banking field, who worked in a non-managerial, non-supervisory capacity. These are young MBAs who worked for investment banking firms. And if you know anything about investment banking, the employees, they work there at least 60, 65, 70 hours per week. So they're always working more than 44 hours. There are actually very, very few times that they're not working that much. And yes, they get paid a lot of money. Sometimes their basic salary is $150,000, $120,000, plus they get bonuses on top of that. So are they entitled to overtime pay? As far as the legislation is concerned, as far as the law is concerned, as it stands today, absolutely yes. And I've launched a number of court actions in which we claimed overtime pay for these very highly paid individuals because they were not given overtime pay by their employers. So whether you make low income or high income has no bearing on your entitlement to overtime pay. What about supervisory versus non-supervisory roles? So this is one factor which has an absolute bearing on whether you're entitled to overtime pay. So this is the one that makes a difference. If you are a supervisory employee, you are not entitled to overtime pay. Only non-supervisory employees are entitled to overtime pay. Where is this principle, where is this rule coming from? It is coming from Employment Standards Act, and I'll show you where this exemption is. But if you are in a supervisory capacity, you are not entitled to overtime pay. But there is a caution here. You want to keep in mind the difference between the substance and the form. What do I mean by that? Are you an employee who is actually working in a non-supervisory capacity, but just carry a fancy title as a manager? If that's the case, then you are still entitled to overtime pay. Your title is not what the court considers. It's what you actually do. So I'll give you an example. I've had a number of clients who had worked for pharmacies and they had the title of manager of pharmacy, but in essence, they were only spending maybe 30 minutes or less on any managerial work, which was scheduling other people's schedules for the day or for the week. And for the rest of the time during the day, they were stocking merchandise in the shelves, they were receiving merchandise, they were acting as shipper-receiver, they were working as a cashier, they were mopping floors. All of these tasks were non-managerial tasks, and those were the tasks that they were doing 80%, 90% of the time, and the managerial role was very limited. So for the time that they were working or performing non-managerial tasks, if they had accumulated more than 44 hours per week, they were absolutely entitled to overtime pay. Another example I can give you is I had a client who was an executive chef at a very high-end hotel. They had chains all around the world. And he approached me for some other matter, and when I asked him about his hours, he worked excessively long hours, and I suggested to him that he was entitled to overtime pay, and he rejected that, saying that he was an executive chef, which was a managerial position, and he could not have been entitled to overtime pay. And I responded to him that that was not correct, because I had seen, like you, a number of shows on television that show these chefs working, and you realize that majority of the time a chef is actually working in the kitchen with his or her hands, preparing stuff, preparing meals and whatnot. And so when I delved deeper into his day, I realized that his managerial role was not, more than 5% of his work, and the rest of the time he was actually preparing meals with his hands, which was not considered a managerial task. And so he was entitled to a significant amount of overtime pay. So consider that if your role has a title that sounds like a supervisory role or a managerial role, it does not matter. What matters is what were the nature of your duties, and if your duties were such that they were considered non-managerial, non-supervisory, then you will still be entitled to overtime pay for that work. So let's get to exemptions. Now, as I said, everybody who works for 44 hours plus in a week is entitled to overtime pay, and then I'm talking about exemptions. So the same Employment Standards Act that says that you're entitled to overtime pay also provides under what circumstances you're not entitled to overtime pay. And I'll talk about Ontario Regulation 285 sub 01, Section 2, same regulation Section 8, and same regulation Section 13 to 18. So let's have a quick look at those regulations and see what we can discern from that. So I've opened here the Ontario regulation, and just so you know what a regulation is, regulations are rules that are made that are kind of subsidiary to the major legislation. So this regulation is under Employment Standards Act. It's called OREG 285 sub 1, and let's go down to the table of content, and when we go here on Section 2, exemption regarding various parts of Act, and exemption for Part 7 to 9 of the Act. And remember that Part 8 is the one that talks about overtime pay. So this specific exemption is 7, 8, and 9. So who are the people who are exempted from overtime pay? Let's click on that, and it says Part 7, 8, and 9, 10, and 11, from Part 7 to 11 of the Act do not apply to a person employed as a duly qualified practitioner of architecture, law, professional engineering, public accounting, surveying, veterinary science, so on and so forth. There's an entire list. So two things to keep in mind, that all of these people are exempt, so they're not entitled to overtime pay even if they're working more than 44 hours. So an architect who is working, duly qualified practitioner, so that means that person is actually a licensed architect, or a lawyer who is working as a lawyer. Now, if a lawyer who's working as a business manager for a company or as a business associate for a company, then he's not working as a qualified practitioner of law. So there's a bit more detail into how you want to read this. But these are examples of some of the professions or individuals in those professions who are not entitled to overtime pay: chiropody, chiropractic, dentistry, massage therapy, duly registered practitioner of drugless, so this is a registered practitioner under the Drugless Practitioners Act, a teacher, a student in a training, specific concepts, right? A salesperson. So all of these people are not entitled to overtime pay. So that's one category of people who are not entitled to overtime pay. And then it doesn't end there. So let's look at another category, and we go down to exemption regarding overtime pay, Section 8. And when you read this section, Part 8 of the Act does not apply to, and there are other people, firefighters. And this is the one that I was talking about, a person whose work is supervisory or managerial in character. So he's actually, or she's actually working in that capacity, and who may perform non-supervisory or non-managerial tasks on an irregular or exceptional basis, right? So remember I said that if majority of the time you're working in non-managerial capacity, then you are entitled to overtime pay. But if you are a managerial employee, but you are occasionally working in non-managerial capacity, then you're exempted. You're not entitled to. Then there are odd exceptions, like a person employed as a fishing or hunting guide, a person employed as a landscape gardener, the one who's installing swimming pools, and so on and so forth. There's a whole list of that. And then information technology professional is not entitled to it. Why are these people exempt from overtime pay? I cannot answer that. Is that justified? I cannot answer that. But just so you know that there are a number of exemptions for people who are not entitled to overtime pay. And so if you want to be accurate, you want to check the legislation properly and make sure that you understand who are not entitled to overtime pay. And then there's a third category that I'd mentioned, section 13 to 18, and let's quickly look at that category. And then it says people who are working in road building, there are certain specific sections that say that they are not entitled to overtime pay. Hotels, motels, tourist resorts, restaurants, and taverns, people who are working in fresh fruit and vegetable processing, sewer and water main construction, local cartage, highway transport. So there are further exemptions for people so that they're not entitled to overtime pay. So what you want to remember, the message that you want to carry is that you never ever assume that you are not entitled to overtime pay. Should not assume that. You always keep records of the hours that you work. You keep those records outside of the office, in your home, on your home computer, so that when you need to prove that you actually worked hours more than 45, you have some record to prove that. And you always want to consult an employment lawyer, because there are, as I showed you, there are so many specific exemptions and how the law is applied in those exemptions that you may want to make sure that if you don't understand it clearly yourself, then talk to a lawyer so that you can understand whether you're entitled to overtime pay or not. But I can tell you from experience, the majority of people who come to us, they have either no understanding of when they're entitled to overtime pay and not, or they assume that the employer will be abiding by all the applicable laws, and when they're entitled to overtime pay, they will get those. But if you watch the news, if you read the news, you will realize that there are a number of class action lawsuits against many major corporations for unpaid overtime pay. And so this is something that is not uncommon, and many employers, either by ignorance or just by sheer neglect, fail to pay overtime pay to their employees. So if you have any specific questions about this topic, or you want some clarification, please comment on YouTube or send us an email, and we'll be happy to add further lectures on this topic. Thank you for watching.